The first time Maeva laid eyes on him, the chill of the morning wind cut through her like a blade sharper than any man's rifle. She had never been in a situation like this, not tied to a wooden post in the middle of a bustling riverfront market, surrounded by the jeering of strangers who saw her not as a person, but as a commodity. Her wrists ached where the rope bit into her skin, the coarse fibers leaving angry red marks. Maeva, a woman of 30, had survived far more dangerous odds in her life bandits, betrayal, and the relentless harshness of frontier life, but this public auction made her stomach twist with a mixture of anger and fear. The market was alive with motion and noise, a chaos of merchants shouting, coins clinking, and townsfolk jeering. Stalls overflowed with sacks of grain, bundles of fresh herbs, and barrels of fish glinting in the weak sun. But Maeva barely noticed the produce or wares. Her gaze was fixed on a shadowed man standing apart from the crowd, perched on a wooden crate as if the world belonged to him and he alone had the right to judge it. He was a striking figure, tall, with long black hair streaked with silver, braided with beads and small feathers that caught the sunlight. His dark eyes, deep as river mud after a storm, scanned the crowd with precision, and a scar running from temple to cheek made his expression severe. Bronze armlets hugged his muscular arms, and his long, weathered coat swung loosely around his legs, the leather creaking as he moved. Maeva's heart thumped against her ribs. She had been sold to him sight unseen, a transaction carried out by a man too indifferent to look twice. He had purchased her not as a person, but as a prize, a human commodity. Yet something in the way he surveyed her, calm and detached, suggested he was no ordinary buyer. "Tie me up properly," she said boldly, her voice cutting across the murmurs of the crowd. "If you truly wish to free me, prove it." A ripple of laughter ran through the onlookers, but the man didn't flinch. His gaze met hers, unblinking, a strange combination of curiosity and appraisal in his expression. He nodded, a subtle gesture, and the clerk hesitated before loosening the rope around her wrists. She could now move, though only enough to take cautious steps. "You speak too freely," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly. "Few have the courage to dare a man who doesn't fear them." "And fewer still," Maeva replied, chin lifted defiantly, "have the right to own another human being, no matter the gold in their pockets." The market seemed to fade around them, the noise dimming as her words and his presence created a bubble of tension. Maeva's eyes swept over the crowd, noting familiar types, the bounty hunter with his gun belt loose at the hip, the merchant with a crooked smile and a ledger thick with sins, the drunk man who seemed ready to push and jeer but would falter at the first sign of danger. But this man, this purchaser, was different. He carried a calm that was almost predatory, a silence that commanded attention. As the auction continued, Maeva's stomach twisted with anticipation and fear. Coins clinked onto counters, bids shouted, voices rising in greed and expectation. Yet her focus never wavered from the man on the crate. She noticed the subtle ways he moved, how his fingers brushed the feathers braided into his hair, as though they held stories and memories, and how his hand rested lightly on a blade tucked beneath his coat. Every detail suggested a life lived on the edge, one of experience and danger. When the final bid was called, the clerk's voice rang over the crowd. "Sold!" Maeva's stomach lurched. The man with long black hair stepped forward, placing a small pile of gold on the counter. He made no grand gestures, no speech, no indication of triumph or ownership. Instead, he cut the ropes that bound her completely, a small, deliberate act that seemed almost symbolic. "Follow," he said simply, his tone calm but commanding. Maeva hesitated. The streets of the town were unforgiving, the eyes of strangers relentless. But something in his posture told her this was not a man seeking profit, and perhaps not even revenge. Something in his silence promised a path not yet revealed. They mounted horses in near silence, the morning light casting long shadows across the town. Maeva's mind raced, calculating escape routes, allies, and potential traps. The man never spoke, his presence like a constant, silent force beside her. Hours passed as they wound through thick pine forests and rocky hills. The smell of damp earth, pine resin, and wildflowers mingled in the air. Birds called in the distance, and the occasional rustle of small animals reminded her that the wilderness was alive, indifferent and watchful. Maeva studied him as they rode. He was a man of precision, of intent. Every movement seemed deliberate, from the way he adjusted the leather strap across his shoulder to the subtle way his fingers rested near the knife under his coat. She noted the scars on his hands, the calluses that told of years of labor and violence, and the faint tremor in his jaw when he thought no one was watching. He was both a protector and a potential threat, a paradox she could not yet solve. By dusk, they arrived at a secluded clearing where a small cabin sat, almost hidden among the thick cedars. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying the scent of pine and cooking meat. Maeva's pulse quickened. This place was a sanctuary, yet it felt like a trap. "You'll stay here," he said, dismounting. "No one comes near. No one leaves without my permission. And if I refuse?" Maeva asked, stepping down with careful grace. He tilted his head, the scar on his face catching the last glint of sunlight. "Refusal is an option," he said. "But I promise you, survival is not." The forest was alive as night fell, the shadows long and whispering. Owls called from unseen perches, wolves howled in the distance, and the wind stirred the cedar needles like ghosts brushing past. Maeva's heart thumped in her chest, but she refused to show it. She would not give him the satisfaction. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, and the air smelled of smoke, pine, and the faint scent of leather from the man's coat. He offered her a blanket, a gesture of practicality more than kindness, and she accepted it with a careful nod. "You have questions," he said, finally breaking the silence. Maeva met his eyes. "And you have secrets," she replied, her voice firm. He did not answer immediately, only stared into the fire. The tension was palpable, a fragile truce between two people who were still strangers yet bound by circumstance. Maeva felt her instincts sharpen. She would need them. She could sense that this man carried burdens, enemies, and a past he did not intend to reveal easily. For hours, they sat in quiet proximity, the firelight dancing across their faces. Maeva's thoughts drifted to her own past family lost to disease, betrayal by someone she had trusted, the hard lessons that had forced her to rely only on herself. She realized that despite being a captive in this strange man's custody, she had agency in other ways. She could observe, learn, and wait for the right moment to act. By midnight, sleep finally came, uneasy and dream-filled. Maeva dreamt of the river that cut through the valley, the forests where prey and predator danced their eternal game, and the shadowed man whose presence haunted her waking and sleeping thoughts alike. In her dream, he was both ally and threat, protector and enigma. The first part of her journey was ending, and she knew the true trials had yet to begin. She had been sold, yes, but now, in the solitude of the forest, she was no longer just a commodity. She was a witness to a new world, a participant in a story she could shape, if only she survived the man who had bought her, and the dangers that lay beyond. The night deepened, the wind whispered through the cedars, and Maeva understood one immutable truth: she would fight. She would endure, and she would claim her freedom on her own terms. The morning mist lay thick over the valley, curling around the pines and dampening the forest floor like a veil. Maeva woke to the sound of water rushing somewhere nearby, a soft, persistent murmur that carried through the trees. Her wrists ached where the ropes had once held her, But the lingering stiffness reminded her that even in freedom, the past left marks. She unrolled the blanket Hurry had left her by the fire and stepped outside the cabin. Her bare feet sinking into the moss and dew-soaked soil, Hurry was already at the riverbank. His long black hair braided with beads and feathers, glinting faintly in the early sunlight. He stood perfectly still, the spear in his hands poised over the water as if he could read its currents with a thought. The wind carried the scent of pine, earth, and the faint tang of fish. Maeva's pulse quickened not out of fear, but anticipation. She had never seen someone move with such precision, such patience, as Hurry did in those moments. "You fish?" she asked cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Observe," he said, his dark eyes scanning the water, calculating, waiting. "Learn what the river tells you." Maeva knelt by the water's edge, letting her fingers skim the cold current. The river was alive, rushing with a quiet, ceaseless determination. It reminded her of herself, unbroken despite the chains that had tried to claim her. Hurry's gaze never left her, though, measuring, assessing, and silently testing her. She wondered if he understood that her mind worked faster than her body, if he knew that survival was as much mental as it was physical. Days settled into a rhythm, each one teaching Maeva lessons she hadn't realized she needed. She learned how to read the clouds for storms, how to track the deer and rabbit through the underbrush, how to gather herbs that could soothe pain or stop infection. Hurry offered guidance sparingly, corrections only when her approach threatened failure or danger. Yet even in his silence, he spoke volumes through his actions, the way he tied knots, the way he moved through the forest without disturbing a single branch, the way he watched the sky for changes in the wind. At first, Maeva had resisted him. She refused to rely on anyone, even him. She was a survivor. Independence was her shield. But slowly, through small gestures, a blade handed to her without a word. A fire stoked just right to keep her warm. A warning glance that saved her from stepping on a snake hidden beneath a leaf. She began to understand that Hurry's presence was not a threat but a lifeline. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, casting the forest in gold and shadow, Maeva sat by the river, examining the fish they had caught. Hurry appeared from the tree line with a bundle of wild herbs, water dripping from his coat. He knelt beside her without speaking, placing the bundle down gently. "For the fever," he said simply. Maeva looked at him, startled by the softness in his voice. She took the herbs with a cautious nod. "You're different," she said, uncertain why she trusted him even now. "Different how?" he asked, eyes fixed on the water. "Not like the others." "You don't treat me as property, though you could," Maeva replied, a mixture of defiance and curiosity in her tone. Hurry said nothing, only watched the river, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. Maeva felt the weight of unspoken truths between them, the tension of secrets waiting to be uncovered. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a strange sense of safety, not comfort, not attachment, but a recognition that he might be the only person who could match her strength. That night, the forest spoke in whispers. Maeva lay awake in the cabin, listening to the wind stir the cedar branches and the distant howl of a lone wolf. Memories she had buried deep clawed their way to the surface. The family she had lost to illness, the betrayal of a partner she had trusted implicitly, and the narrow escapes from bandits in lands even wilder than this. In her dream, the forest shifted into shapes of predators and shadows, and Hurry was both a figure of protection and mystery, moving through the dream like a guide through a treacherous path. By the second morning, the rhythm of the wilderness had become a part of her. She moved with purpose, gathering firewood, tending the small cooking fire, and tracking small game. Hurry observed silently, correcting only when she was about to make a mistake that could cost them both. But then, The river brought an unexpected interruption, a wounded man staggering from the underbrush. Leaving a trail of blood on the mossy ground, Hurry reacted instantly, catching the man before he collapsed entirely. Maeva's heart raced as she watched the precision and strength of his movements. He knelt, assessing the injuries with a practiced eye, and then motioned Maeva forward. "Help him," he commanded. The man's story unfolded slowly between gasps of pain. His name was Elias, and he had been ambushed by a rival gang while transporting supplies. Bruised and bleeding, he had been left for dead. The irony was not lost on Maeva. She, too, had narrowly escaped a cruel fate at the hands of men driven by greed and violence. For hours, they tended to his wounds by the riverbank. Maeva had never felt so intimately connected to survival, to life teetering on a knife's edge. The air smelled of wet pine, blood, and the faint tang of iron. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the river gold, and for a moment, all three of them were suspended in fragile equilibrium. Hurry moved silently as he worked, his scarred hands steady, precise, and unhurried. Maeva studied him in this quiet chaos, noticing the subtle tremor in his jaw that betrayed the calm he tried to project. She realized he was carrying burdens of his own, scars that went beyond flesh, hidden and deep, etched into his mind and spirit. That night, after Elias had fallen into a fitful sleep, Maeva and Hurry sat by the fire. Smoke curled in lazy spirals above them, the stars reflected in the black surface of the river beyond the clearing. Maeva's voice broke the silence. "Why help him?" she asked softly, eyes fixed on the flames. Hurry's gaze met hers, dark and unreadable. "Because some debts are not paid in gold," he said simply. "Because life is fragile, and we choose who survives it." The weight of his words lingered. Maeva understood then that Hurry's motives were not simple, not purely moral, not purely mercenary. He moved through life by his own rules, honoring a code she could only guess at. And she was now entwined in it whether she liked it or not. Sleep came slowly, haunted by the memories of the past and the uncertainty of the future. Maeva dreamed again of rivers, wolves, and shadows, of the life she had lost and the life she might yet claim. In her dreams, Hurry was both a figure of guidance and a mirror, reflecting the strength she had always possessed but never fully acknowledged. The next day, the forest seemed more alive than ever. Birds flitted between branches, deer watched from a distance, and the river ran with a clarity that mirrored the sky. Maeva felt a subtle shift within herself. She was no longer the frightened captive from the auction. She was becoming something stronger, shaped by the wilderness, by Hurry's silent tutelage, and by her own relentless will to survive. As they prepared for another day of tracking and fishing, Elias stirred and looked at them with gratitude that did not need words. Maeva realized that in helping him, they had created a bond, however fragile, that tied them together in this isolated, unforgiving place. And she understood something even more profound. Hurry was no longer merely her captor or mysterious protector. He was a man who lived by rules she did not yet fully understand. A man whose past was as shadowed and untamed as the forests themselves, and a man who, in some unspoken way, needed her as much as she needed him. Maeva's hands itched to practice with the spear Hurry had taught her to handle, her muscles eager for the control, the precision. She realized that survival here was a partnership, one built not on ownership or fear, but on trust, observation, and the willingness to act when necessary. Hurry's presence was a constant challenge, and she found herself growing sharper, quicker, and more perceptive under his silent scrutiny. By evening, the three of them sat by the fire again, the river whispering nearby. Maeva felt the strange comfort of exhaustion, the kind that comes after a day spent living fully, deliberately, and dangerously. She glanced at Hurry, seeing him not as the shadowed man of the auction, but as a figure whose complexity she had only begun to fathom. The firelight caught his scar, his feathers, his long hair braided with beads, and she felt a flicker of understanding that this man, mysterious and dangerous, was not just a presence in her life. He was now a force shaping it, teaching her lessons she would never have learned in safety or solitude. And as the forest whispered around them, Maeva realized that the days ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. But she was ready. She had to be. In the wilderness, with Hurry at her side, she was learning the truth she had always avoided, that freedom was earned, danger was inevitable, and survival was the only path to claiming either. Ironwood lay ahead like a shadowed promise, its wooden structures half hidden by the thick evening haze. The town smelled of smoke, sweat, and old secrets, a mix that made Maeva's stomach tighten with anticipation. She had never walked its creaking boardwalks before, but she had seen enough frontier towns to know that every glance carried judgment and every smile often hid a knife. Hurry moved beside her, silent and precise, his long black hair braided and swinging lightly with each step. The feathers and beads glinted faintly in the dim light, and the bronze armlets on his arms caught what little sunlight remained. He was a man in complete control of himself and the situation, and Maeva felt that old mix of fascination and unease in her chest. They entered the town from the edge of the forest, the shadows of the pines still clinging to their backs. Maeva could hear the faint clatter of hooves, the distant laughter of drunken men, and the occasional bark of a dog. She kept her eyes on the buildings, noting the saloon with its swinging doors, the general store with a loose shutter, and the sheriff's office that looked more like a jail than a law-enforcing institution. Hurry's gaze was fixed straight ahead, assessing the town, reading its people, and anticipating threats Maeva could barely guess at. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and tension. The wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of boots, and the smell of cheap whiskey mixed with the faint tang of blood from a brawl earlier in the week. Maeva's nerves tightened, but Hurry's presence beside her was grounding. He had taught her patience, observation, and the subtle power of silence. Now she understood that watching and waiting could be as lethal as a loaded gun. They moved to a shadowed corner, where a few poker tables had been pushed together. The rival awaited them, Caldwell, a man with a reputation as brutal as the scars on his face suggested. He was perched arrogantly at the table, a deck of cards in his hands, and a pistol tucked into his coat, his smug smile daring anyone to challenge him. Maeva recognized the danger immediately. This was not a man to negotiate with. Caldwell had been the reason Hurry had withdrawn from Ironwood years ago, a betrayal that had left unfinished business simmering beneath the surface. Hurry's hand brushed against Maeva's arm, a fleeting gesture that spoke of readiness and caution. She had grown to trust this subtle communication between them. It was unspoken but clear. Move carefully, act deliberately, and trust your instincts. Maeva felt a spark of confidence. The forest, the river, and the nights by the fire had taught her the rhythm of survival, and she now knew she could face this man without panic, without fear clouding her judgment. The confrontation began with words, sharp and precise. Caldwell's tone was mocking, filled with the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. Hurry's voice, when it came, was calm, gravelly, and unyielding. Maeva felt the tension coil like a spring in the room, the air thick with anticipation. The patrons of the saloon sensed the danger, some ducking behind tables, others peeking from shadowed corners, unsure if they should intervene or flee. Maeva's instincts kicked in. She noticed the angles, the exits, the positions of potential threats. She slipped to a place where she could see Caldwell's hand on his gun, aware of Hurry's positioning as he shifted slightly, ready to move with lethal precision. Time seemed to slow as she realized that this confrontation was not just about revenge. It was a test of skill, patience, and courage. She was no longer a captive in this story. She was a participant, an observer, and potentially a decisive factor in what would come next. Suddenly, Caldwell made a move, his pistol drawn with a practiced flick. The saloon erupted into chaos. Chairs toppled, glasses shattered, and the floorboards creaked with the weight of rushing bodies. Hurry reacted instantly, moving with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. Maeva ducked behind a table, her hands steady as she grabbed a fallen chair to shield herself. She could hear the bullets splinter wood near her feet, feel the vibration of the floor, taste the copper tang of danger in the air. Hurry's voice was a low command, precise and urgent. "Stay down," he said. Maeva obeyed, heart racing, body taut with readiness. She watched as Hurry moved with lethal efficiency, disarming Caldwell with a combination of strength, speed, and careful calculation. The rival went down, stunned but alive, the weight of his defeat evident in his frozen expression. Maeva's own pulse began to steady, the adrenaline slowly receding into a focused awareness. When the chaos subsided, the saloon was filled with the acrid scent of smoke and the sharp tang of fear. Patrons peeked from behind corners, their eyes wide with astonishment and relief that the violence had ended without fatality. Maeva rose slowly, brushing dust from her coat, her eyes never leaving Hurry. She could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle tremor in his fingers that betrayed the calm he projected. He was human, after all, even if he appeared otherwise. "You've changed," Hurry said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper as they moved toward the door. "And you?" Maeva countered, keeping pace with him. "You're not the man I thought I knew either." The walk back to the forest was quiet, the air carrying the lingering echoes of the confrontation. Maeva felt a strange sense of accomplishment, not just for surviving the saloon, but for realizing that she had contributed, that her presence and actions mattered in ways she had never allowed herself to believe before. Hurry's silence was not the absence of words, she understood now. It was a form of respect, a recognition of her growth and capability. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the first stars were peeking through the fading light. Maeva's thoughts drifted to the river, the cabin, and the firelight that had once seemed small and fragile but now felt like the foundation of something enduring. She understood that the forest had changed her, that the lessons Hurry had taught were more than survival skills, they were the tools of independence, trust, and measured courage. Night fell fully, the forest alive with sound and movement. Wolves howled in the distance, and the rustle of unseen animals reminded Maeva that they were never truly alone. Hurry tended the fire with his usual precision, stacking the wood in a way that maximized warmth and efficiency. Maeva watched him, noting the care in each motion, the unspoken mindfulness that reflected a life forged in hardship and skill. She realized that this man, mysterious and distant as he sometimes seemed, had a code she respected and could understand, a code that bound them together in purpose and mutual reliance. Sleep came slowly, heavy with the tension of the day and the echoes of what had transpired in Ironwood. Maeva dreamed of shadows and gunfire, of Caldwell's sneer and the chaotic energy of the saloon. But amid the chaos, Hurry's figure remained constant, a stabilizing force guiding her through the night. She felt a strange warmth in that thought, a recognition that she was no longer completely alone. That partnership could exist even in the harshest of landscapes, even among strangers bound by circumstance rather than choice. The next morning, the sun rose over the valley in a soft wash of gold, illuminating the forest in a way that made the pines glow like emerald towers. Maeva stood by the river, watching the current twist and turn over rocks and debris. She had learned to read the water now, to understand its subtle shifts and patterns, Just as she had learned to read Hurry, to anticipate his movements and intentions, Hurry joined her silently, his coat brushing the tops of the grasses, and together they surveyed the river. Elias, the injured man from days before, was moving cautiously along the bank, now strong enough to help gather firewood and carry supplies. The three of them moved with a rhythm that felt natural, almost familial, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Maeva understood that this was more than survival. It was a forging of trust, of bond, and of understanding that strength alone was not enough without guidance, observation, and cooperation. As they worked, Maeva found herself thinking about the forest differently, about the river differently, about the man named Hurry differently. The man who had once bought her as property now shared space and purpose with her, and she recognized that the lines between captive and protector, observer and participant were shifting. She was no longer merely surviving. She was living, fully and deliberately, in a way she hadn't known she could. By the river's edge, as the sun climbed higher, Hurry finally spoke of the past that had led him to Ironwood, of the rival who had threatened his life and his principles. Maeva listened intently, realizing that every scar, every silent gesture, every choice he had made was rooted in a complex life of loss, duty, and honor. She felt her respect deepen, her understanding of the man grow, and the strange tether of trust that had begun in the auction now strengthened into something durable, resilient, and rare. As the day waned, they returned to the cabin, the forest alive with the hum of life around them. Maeva felt a sense of accomplishment, of mastery over the challenges of survival and conflict alike. She had faced danger, chaos, and uncertainty, and she had emerged sharper, more capable, and more aware of the fragile threads of trust and skill that bound them together. And as the night fell once again, the fire casting flickering shards on the walls of the cabin, Maeva understood a truth she had long resisted. Freedom was not merely the absence of chains, and survival was not merely endurance. Spring had returned to the valley in a riot of green and gold, and the forest hummed with life. Birds called to each other from the treetops, squirrels darted along the branches, and the river sparkled like a ribbon of silver in the morning sun. Maeva stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing out across the open space where the cabin had once been their refuge. She had spent weeks here, learning to survive, to fight, and to trust not just the wilderness, but the man who had brought her into it. Hurry emerged from the trees, his long black hair catching the light, the beads and feathers braided into it swinging gently with each step. His coat, worn and weathered, brushed against the tips of the grass, and his bronze armlets gleamed faintly. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers, and for the first time in weeks, Maeva felt the tension between them ease into something more profound than mere survival. "I never wanted to own you," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of truth. "I wanted to protect you from the world and from yourself." Maeva studied him, the anger, distrust, and fear she had carried slowly melting into something softer, more understanding. She remembered the auction, the ride through the forest, the river, the saloon in Ironwood, the injured man they had saved. All of it had been a journey through danger, discovery, and trust. Now, the final act of that journey lay before them, not in conflict, but in choice. "Then why tie me up?" Maeva asked, her voice steady. "Why buy me at all if not to control me?" "Because freedom without understanding is meaningless," Hurry replied, his gaze unwavering. "You had to see that you could survive on your own terms. You had to fight for it, to claim it yourself." Maeva felt a flicker of respect mixed with relief. She had faced bandits, betrayal, and chaos, yet she had emerged alive, stronger and sharper. Hurry's lessons had been harsh, silent, and unyielding, but they had been true. She understood now that survival was more than endurance. It was mastery over circumstance, skill, and the choices that shaped one's life. She stepped closer. To him, the wind carrying the scents of pine, wet earth, and the faint aroma of the river. "I'm not your captive," she said, her voice carrying authority and clarity. "I'm your equal." "And I would have it no other way," he replied. The river beyond the clearing murmured softly, a constant reminder of life's persistence and the passage of time. Maeva let herself take a deep breath, feeling the weight of weeks of tension lift from her shoulders. She had survived, yes, but more importantly, she had chosen. The cabin, the forest, and the river had taught her that freedom was not granted, it was claimed, and she had claimed it with her own hands, her own decisions, and her own courage. Elias, now fully recovered, approached from the forest edge, carrying a bundle of firewood. His eyes were filled with gratitude and quiet awe. Maeva smiled at him, acknowledging the bond they had formed in the past days, a bond forged in survival and mutual reliance. Hurry watched the exchange silently, a faint nod passing between him and Elias, acknowledging the respect that had grown between them. The morning passed in quiet reflection. Maeva and Hurry walked along the riverbank, observing the movement of the water and the wildlife that thrived along its edges. The forest felt alive in a way it never had before, vibrant with color, sound, and movement. Maeva realized that this life, while harsh, was honest and unrelenting, and it demanded more from her than the world beyond the forest ever had. As they reached a bend in the river, Maeva stopped and turned to Hurry. "What now?" she asked. "We've survived. We've faced the threats. We've seen the worst of what men can do." Hurry paused, watching the sunlight dance across the water. "Now we live," he said simply. "Now we decide what kind of life we choose together or apart, but free, always free." Maeva felt a surge of emotion she had rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, relief, gratitude, and a tentative hope. The forest had been a crucible, shaping her into someone stronger, sharper, and more resilient. Hurry had been the constant. Through it all, his presence both a challenge and a guide, his silence a form of respect and trust that she now understood fully. They spent the day gathering food, checking traps, and repairing the cabin's remains. Every movement was deliberate, a testament to the skills they had honed together. Maeva realized that in this life, partnership was more than proximity. It was awareness, mutual reliance, and the shared burden of survival. Hurry's methods, though quiet and sometimes severe, had been essential in shaping her into someone capable of facing not just the forest, but the world beyond it. By evening, the forest was bathed in a golden glow, the sun dipping low behind distant hills. Maeva and Hurry sat by what remained of their fire, the smoke curling lazily into the sky. Elias had moved on to return to a small settlement, leaving Maeva and Hurry alone once again. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable, it was a recognition of the bond they had forged through shared hardship, danger, and trust. Maeva broke the silence. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice soft. "Buying me, bringing me here, putting yourself in danger?" Hurry's gaze met hers, dark and steady. "Regret is for those who lack purpose," he said. "I acted because it had to be done, because you needed the freedom to understand your own strength, and because I could not leave you to the world alone." Maeva's heart tightened. She understood the gravity of his words, the depth of the responsibility he had carried silently. She had never felt so seen, so understood, and yet so challenged by another human being. The fear she had carried at the auction was gone, replaced by something more complex: respect, trust, and the fragile stirrings of connection. Night descended. Fully, the forest alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Maeva lay on the soft grass outside the cabin, staring up at the stars reflected in the river. The air was cool but not biting, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and the faint smoke of their last fire. Hurry joined her, lying close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but distant enough that respect for space remained. "You've changed," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "Not just stronger, not just wiser. Different," Maeva smiled faintly. "And you? Not just silent and distant anymore either." He allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Perhaps," he admitted, "perhaps we both survived more than we thought we could." In that moment, Maeva understood something fundamental. Their journey had not been just about survival. It had been about trust, respect, and the choices that define a life. Hurry had given her the opportunity to reclaim herself, and she had seized it. In turn, she had proven that she was capable, resilient, and worthy of partnership, not ownership, not control, but equality. The night passed with the sound of the river as a lullaby, the wind through the pines as a reminder of life's ceaseless flow. Maeva felt a sense of peace she had never known, tempered by the knowledge that the world beyond the forest remained unpredictable and dangerous. But for the first time, she believed she could face it not as a captive, not as prey, but as a woman in command of her own fate. By morning, the forest was alive with light and possibility. Maeva and Hurry prepared to move again, to continue their lives on their own terms. They mounted their horses, checking the tack and supplies with careful attention, and together they rode along the riverbank, the water glinting like liquid sunlight. The world stretched ahead, full of uncertainty, challenge, and opportunity. Maeva felt the exhilaration of choice, the thrill of survival, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding her own strength. As they disappeared into the trees, Maeva looked back once at the clearing, the cabin, the river. They were all pieces of a story that had tested her, shaped her, and freed her. Hurry rode beside her, silent but present, a constant reminder that partnership could exist even in the harshest wilderness, and that freedom was something to be earned, shared, and cherished. And so, their journey continued, not with chains, not with fear, but with trust, understanding, and the knowledge that they had faced the trials of the Old West and emerged alive, unbroken, and together. Maeva, no longer captive, and Hurry, no longer distant, rode into the horizon, the wilderness around them a testament to the life they had claimed for themselves. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer burdens, they were proof of survival, of resilience, and of the rare and precious treasure they had found in each other, a bond forged in fire, blood, and the untamed beauty of the frontier. Freedom had been claimed, trust had been earned, and the forest whispered its approval, carrying their story forward on the wind, a tale of courage, choice, and the enduring power of human connection.